Hi, Olathe. It's Rich Wilson from Learning Services. And I can't be with you tonight because I have another activity that I have to be at. So tonight you're going to get digital rich. And you've been talking through the EPIC training tonight about, what's an A, right? What's in a grade? And what are those things that I have to consider as I'm reporting um, grades into Synergy or report cards and those kinds of things. And so I wanted to add a little bit to that, even though I can't be with you tonight. So a couple of years ago, I was at a conference and I sat in on a session by a Dr. Thomas Guskey. He's a professor at the University of Kentucky, and he is probably the leading authority on assessing purposes and philosophies. And I was really lucky I got a chance to talk with him afterwards. And so he shared even more of his philosophies, and I was able to really ask him a lot of questions and kind of get my head wrapped around moving away from some practices that I had had as a teacher. So one of the things that he talked about that night was just the purpose of grading. Why do we grade? One of those reasons is fairly obvious, and we just have groups of parents, maybe all parents, that want to know where their students lay. If they are students are doing well, they're doing poorly. When they get into high school, are they going to have the grades to get into college? Are they ready? So obviously, being able to report to parents is a big thing. But I would say more importantly than that, it's this idea that as a teacher, I need grades to help me. I need grades to help me select or identify students who are in need, or to identify a group of students maybe who are ready for the next thing or ready to go deeper. So grades can help me with that part as well. The other piece that I think we need to grow into as educators is involving the students in that self-evaluation process. That when they get a grade back, that they not only get the grade, but they get feedback, and then they have the opportunity to decide what their next steps are and working with the teacher towards those next steps. I just think that's vitally important. Grades also help us evaluate our programs. Some of those grades are really about like the Kansas Assessment or MAP or ACT, those things that kind of give us an evaluation or an overview of how our students did over the course of a year. Often that will give us a glimpse into our programs and whether we need to make some changes or not. These last two things, I think, are really worth the discussion and worth considering. So when we create grades and we report grades, I think we need to really think about, have I put some incentives in there? Have I put things into my grade that really don't have to do with my students moving towards mastery of standards? Do I have extra credit? Do I have responsibility grades in there? And I'm not saying those are bad, and I don't think Dr. Guskey would say they were bad. I do think, though, that the more of those we have and the larger that percentage of our grade becomes, it really waters down the reporting of how students have learned. So I think we want to be really careful about that and focus more on the learning than we do on responsibility and incentives and those kinds of things. So Dr. Guskey also talked about, if we kind of understand this philosophy of why we've had, or the purpose of grading and why we may have graded in the past, let's make sure we're really thinking about the philosophy behind that. So these first two things I think go hand in hand. So one is that grading is not essential for you to instruct. It's also not essential for students to learn. So instruction and learning can occur without ever recording a grade in Synergy, ever, or putting a grade into Mastery Connect. Learning and teaching are independent of that. The grade itself is about a report, right? What I'm telling other people about that student. So I don't necessarily have to, and one of the things I think that's really important about this is that if I am going to begin to grade based on how kids are learning standards, then I know that any other things that I'm doing in a more formative way, I don't necessarily have to have a grade for, because they're informing me and the student about learning. So another thing to consider is this idea that formative assessing is essential for that learning, right? It helps teachers become an advocate for learning, because Teachers will then take that information and change instruction or add additional instruction into it. It's not said here, but it also allows the student to be an advocate for their own learning, right? Again, grading and the results of assessments should all move towards learning and not necessarily just an A, B, or C. Another really important piece that Dr. Gusky talked about was we have to know the purpose for our grading. And again, I think if we are teaching at a standards level, we should be assessing at a standards level, and we should be grading at a standards level. And I don't necessarily mean that we have to go towards a standards-based grade card. We're probably quite a few years away from that happening. But I do think that we can begin to consider about what we're grading and what we're recording, and is it at the standards level? Is it at that place? We also want to make sure that our grades, again, this kind of went back to like the incentives piece, is that are we really learning or grading on learning criteria? Like, do we know what mastery looks like for a standard? And if we know what mastery looks like, and we're formatively assessing to get kids to that mastery level, almost at no time should we ever have to worry about curving or changing grades for kids, because formatively we would have known ahead of time whether students were ready or not. And then the last thing here is that in your grading, we can't let a formula be the one deciding factor on a grade, right? My own son, he lives in the 89.4.5 area all the time. And he has times where teachers should give him a B based on his on what he's learned. But there's other times where maybe he didn't turn in some assignments, but he's done really, really well at the standards level, and he should receive an A. That's just one example, but one that lives in our house. So I just thought I'd throw that out. The last thing I wanted to address here is about assessing. So there's two different main kinds of assessing. We have formative assessments, or another way of saying that is assessments for learning, assessments that help promote learning, and summative assessments, which are assessments of learning, or they're assessments of the learning that has already occurred. As you know, with the Mastery Connect tool, we are really living heavy in this formative assessing area, and I think it's great. So when you talk about formative assessing, that is assessing that is reflective of current student learning, where students are today, and how far along they are in terms of learning the standards and mastering the standards. These are quick and easy, maybe not easy for the students, but they should be quick. They should be short. These are like bell ringers and exit tickets and short little quizzes. They also can be informal as teachers are gathering information about how their students are. Because this is about student learning that is currently going on, it should also drive your instruction to address those needs that their assessment has reflected, address those needs immediately, right? That's what a formative assessment allows you to do. And then the last thing is that the stress level should be pretty low, because these guys are low stakes. Often, these are not graded. They are not recorded. They are just quick measures of where kids are as you're trying to move them towards a more summative assessment, which often is graded. Okay? So as we look at summative assessments, the learning is over a longer period of time. Students are pulling ideas together. So because of that, they are longer assessments. They're more in depth. They may have more problems because you're talking about multiple standards. But this is all learning that has already occurred. And so these kinds of assessments reflect how students are able to pull all of that information together. The stress level on these is generally pretty high, because these are high stakes. They count as a grade, or it's like an ACT, so it's counting for college. But instruction at this point doesn't really occur, because these are at the end of learning and not during learning, which is more of what the formative assessments are.